Keep the faith, good friends, and if, yep, I said if, your Pro air conditioner, keep those handy. It won't be long. September 22nd, the start of autumn is not that far off. We'll try to keep you cool, or at least have your friends think you're cool. I'm Bill Culhane with the latest from the Big Bit Theory. As many of you already are aware, over the past 2 episodes, of course, we visited with Dr. Colin Clark, a noted expert on global terrorism. A little later in this edition of TBBT, we'll visit with a global expert on government procurement. And this gentleman, by the way, you'll want to be sure to stay tuned. This guy isn't afraid to roll up his sleeves, get out the magnifying glass, and report if things are awry, if things don't seem quite right. Have little fear. As always, we'll close down the show with your latest crazy bit. And it's not so much crazy as it is, as I'll mention later, it's maybe interesting more than crazy. We'll take a look at what government agencies are doing that leave us pondering and wondering. First, get out your tissues and your miniature violins. In our TBBT travels last week, I visited New Orleans, Louisiana, the Big Easy. In this case, for the first time ever, again, get the tissues ready. I had a flight canceled, not delayed, not switched, nixed, erased. It was canceled. And I came to realize that there's really no feeling quite like approaching the counter at the terminal, entering your confirmation information into the kiosk, and seeing canceled. And as I stood there, I thought, Bill, you entered the incorrect travel information. I re-entered the confirmation number. Again, I got the message your flight's been canceled. Well, long story short, 2 hours later, I got out of Louis Armstrong Airport and had an additional night there in the Big Easy. Stayed out by the airport. And what it meant for the next day, getting things rescheduled, is I woke up at 2:45 a.m. Yeah, I said a.m. And then had a flight from New Orleans to Tampa, Florida. Yep, I said Florida. And then after an hour layover, the flight back home to Austin. And it's okay. You can get out your maps. You can check it out. That's kind of a roundabout way to fly from New Orleans to Austin. And there's Lauren laughing again behind the glass. Thanks a lot, Lauren. I appreciate you caring about my travel. So anyway, it's time for history. For the first time in our relatively short lifespan of TBBT, we go outside the US of A to bring in our special guest. And as I kind of previewed earlier, teased it, it's well worth it. Our guest, Mr. Jon Hansen, comes to us from Quebec up in Canada. Now, in my day job, we come across many people in and around the world of procurement, purchasing, and business. Most of those folks are, going about their daily lives, doing what they do, and that's terrific, and it's all important. Well, Jon Hansen, in case you don't know him, many of you probably do, Jon helps to serve, I say, as the eyes and ears and often the conscience of what's taking place, transpiring in government procurement. And Jon seems to be that person who, when he senses that something isn't right, he doesn't look away. And especially with the elections going on here in the U.S., and we've got, of course, MSNBC, CNN, Fox News, you know the list. Well, if only more in mainstream media would have the same talent, fortitude, and professionalism to follow suit, to really ask the difficult questions, try to get the facts, try to get the answers. Well, anyway, I digress. Because of the treasure trove of solid to very solid information Jon brought up in our upcoming conversation, we're going to be breaking up the interview into 2 parts, one here and one later. You'll remember we did that with Dr. Clark in his conversation about terrorism. And then after that, we'll let Lauren and Braden work out the mechanics on how we're going to break up the 2 parts. So with no further delay, here's part 1 with Jon Hansen. Jon Hansen is on the Big Bit Theory hotline. Of course, this is Bill Culhane still with you. Jon, welcome to the show. We appreciate you taking some time out of your busy schedule to visit with us.
Well, thank you, Bill. And I've got to tell you, and I think I mentioned it in the virtual green room, as I like to call it. I followed your podcast in the past, and you add an interesting dimension to the industry in terms of the way you broaden the scope of coverage. So kudos to you for that.
Well, thank you very much. Now, clearly, Jon, you have a passion for the inner workings of the procurement/purchasing world. Take us back in time, Jon. How did that all start? From where is that rooted, your interest in all this stuff?
Well, you know what? I have to tell you, it started on the practitioner side, first of all. And, I think it's, almost 20 years ago.
Wow.
I was called in to help with a defense contract up here in terms of working out the logistics and delivery for the indirect materials to support the defense infrastructure. And the company that brought me in had a contract with an SLA that called for 90% next day delivery, SLA service level agreement, and they're only at 57%. So I went into that and did some analysis and introduced some interesting analysis, impact of time of day ordering on delivery performance, cost, all of those factors. And using that information within about a 3-month period, was able to turn around the delivery from 57% next day to about 91, 92% next day, which was a great first step. And subsequently, looked at leveraging technology. I built up a software company leveraging one of the first web-based solutions that I eventually sold for about $12 million back in 2000. But it worked on time zone algorithms and weighted algorithms to help to select the right supplier and be able to assure delivery for the next day. So we progressively moved through the practitioner understanding and structure of setting up the logistics, then into the technology, sold the company, and then ultimately, as a result, I guess if you sell a company, people think you know something, and started on the speaking and writing circuit. And, that all came by chance. I was writing articles for different publications with different editors, and as any writer will tell you, the relationship with editors can be a love-hate at times. And somebody said, listen, instead of dealing with different deadlines and different editors, start a blog and let the different publications come and pick and choose what they want to be able to reprint off that. And that's how Procurement Insights really got started in May of 2007. And then in 2009 of March, came across Blog Talk Radio, and I've been around long enough to remember the days of the old tubes and the radios that you used to tune into with the whistling sound.
Sure.
And when I saw Blog Talk Radio, I said, this is interesting. It's a great medium. And so in March 26th, 2009, 26th or 23rd now, we aired our first of what would become 1,000 broadcasts. And again, I never expected it to go that far, but the whole idea was to make the pages of the blog come alive through having interviews with people from the industry, and sometimes we expand a little bit outside of the scope of the industry, but overall, that's really how the evolution started. And if it was, I wouldn't be 100% truthful with you if I said it was part of a grand scheme, because it wasn't. It just sort of evolved, and thanks to the readers and listeners, it continued to grow, and here we are. Knock on wood, still here and still going.
You mentioned your blog, Procurement Insights, and anybody who's read the blog, and I know that some of our listeners have seen your work. You say on your blog, we will seek the truth and will endure the consequences. And you and I talked about it. What did you say, the virtual green room? We kind of talked about it. And this is usually the case with leaders in really any arena, any industry. You've received your share of criticism, and by the way, it's not at all surprising to me that invariably that criticism's coming from people that you're pulling the curtain back on. Go figure. Now, others, and I'm not just talking about procurement, I'm not just talking about government, but other people in your position have kind of waved the proverbial white flag or sacrificed their credibility. You keep pushing forward. Why?
Well, I guess it's self-explanatory. We seek the truth. It's this compulsion to get to the truth, get to the facts, to hear all sides of a story. Because somewhere along the lines, you hope that this will have a positive impact on an industry that you care so much about. I mean, I won't say it's a labor of love, although that's a term that some may use. But, let's look at the way our media covers the industry historically, and we talked about it, Bill, earlier. It's traditionally most of the blogs, most of the analyst firms are deeply connected and rooted in the service provider or vendor side of our business. Now, that was, as I mentioned, kudos to them for capitalizing or recognizing that early on. But the problem is that the business has evolved. It's not a features, functions, benefits type of business where you're showcasing technology. In fact, I would hazard a guess that like the PC before it, what's happening as we move into a cloud-based, driven on-demand world is that the solutions are becoming more commoditized. And thus there is greater importance on elements of the relationships you have with who's behind the company, what's going on at the company, what is the true implementation base or the install base of that company. Have they had successes? Have they had failures? We had to get beyond that stage of reporting based upon financial ties to the very industry we're supposed to cover. And we saw that problem, by the way, to digress with Theranos and that particular sector. But we have to get beyond that, and we have to start to report the true news that has an impact. Technology, while it's important, is not, it is becoming commoditized. And the real differentiator between companies is going to be their ability to deliver and provide service. It's going to be the strategy they have in terms of, how is the company being run? Are they being acquired? Are there issues and problems? I mean, one of the stories that broke last week was with Arizona and the letter that Periscope sent to them saying you can't do an RFP, which was the first time I've ever come across someone in all my years protesting the issuance of the RFP itself. But, these stories are important because they shine a light onto the very real areas of our industry and how we do business that actually has a direct and lasting impact on where we're going to go in the future and the success of implementation. So, that's really the driving force behind it, is let's get to the truth. Let's find out what is at the heart of what we do as an industry, and let's focus on those key elements that are so very, very important that until now, sadly and unfortunately, have been overlooked.
So much to talk about on that note, John, and just a moment ago you used an interesting phrase, shining the light. Well, to take people, our listeners, behind the curtain, how you and I initially crossed paths and how I originally became interested in your work, transparency in government purchasing. And I know you and I traded some Twitter messages, gosh, it was months ago, but it was centered around that theme that you and I share, the concept of transparency in government purchasing. Now, by the way, I use transparency and purchasing in the same sentence. There's a zinger. Well, anyone who followed, John, your report on CodeGate understands you're a fan of transparency and fair play. For our listeners who maybe haven't seen your reporting, don't know what I'm referring to, what is CodeGate?
Well, basically, and this, by the way, started with what I would call a somewhat innocuous post, almost amusing, back in December of 2014. But there was the announcement that Periscope had acquired BidSync, and that Periscope, which is a vendor who sells a solution like Perfect Commerce, like SideQuest, like all of them, had been, through the NIGP, given management and control over the issuance of the licensing for the NIGP code. And that code is the taxonomy that about 33 states and countless other levels of government at the municipal level rely upon to manage their part numbers and SKUs and their entire system. So I raised the question saying, well, it's kind of interesting because the person who looks after the code should be a neutral party. They shouldn't have a vested interest in terms of being able to leverage that code to sell their solution or give them a competitive advantage that would maybe force or fix the market so that the market, whoever utilized or relied upon that code, like those 33 states, would be forced to buy from Periscope their solution or do business with Periscope. And I just said it's a dangerous thing. I made a reference to the immunity idol from Survivor. And when do they play that? What do they do? And this was in December 2014. In March, I received an inside tip, and I want to talk about the sources momentarily, Bill, because I think that's important. It's an indication of how hungry the industry is for getting to the shining of that light and the transparency to which you prefer, and also the courage of some of the people who make my post possible. But, an inside source, highly placed inside source, said, what you wrote about in December, the warning that you gave, that they could use this. Periscope could use what NIGP sold to them, literally the NIGP codes management. It's come to fruition because of a contract in Missouri where Perfect Commerce won the contract. NIGP, in conjunction or through or in I guess working with Periscope, sent a letter indicating that the Perfect Commerce, the winning supplier, winning provider, could lose their license to provide support for the NIGP code, which Missouri was dependent upon, and that was in direct response to the fact that the Perfect Commerce beat out Periscope, and that's the type of conflict that was there. So that's how that story started, and as we gradually worked, we started peeling back the onion. We found other areas of conflict. There were a number of exchanges, which was surprising on the blog with NIGP CEO Rick Grimm, where, he was saying one thing, and, we do our research here. That's one thing that I want to stress is that when we dig and we shine a light, we rely on our sources, but we cross-reference our sources. We verify who those sources are. We verify the information because the integrity of the process is the most important element of this, because we're more interested in getting it right than being right, and that may be a subtle difference. But being right, is not as important in terms of, we want to get it right. And that's the focus, and that's why we went through that whole exercise. So we looked at that and said, there's more things going on here. And ultimately, and unbeknownst to me at that time, and it was leading up into the NIGP conference last year, there's actually an internal audit done of the NIGP and their relationships. And since then, this year, I've made requests to get a copy of that audit and have been met with roadblocks all the way through. In fact, I got a letter from one of the NIGP's lawyers, one of the top 10 law firms in the country, so we're dealing with a big firm, at least that's what they're reported as being, saying that, we're not going to give you any comments, you're not going to get a copy of the report, and if you know what's good for you, basically, stop asking. But you then raise the question on this. That kind of relationship is not arm's length. What's going on? Why isn't the report? And remember, the NIGP trains public sector procurement professionals. They're supposed to have a high degree of transparency, total neutrality. What is going on? And so when you can't get a copy of that report, you have to wonder what's in it. And so those are that's where we're at and how the NIGP story started. A simple observation of a potential conflict in December 2014 that manifested itself into a real life conflict or of interest in March 2015, and one that's produced a report that they are doing everything they can to block my access to that. And I'm going through various government agencies in Florida, Freedom of Information Act, all of these things that we're digging. Wherever avenue we can go through, we're going to continue to go after getting a copy of that report one way or another, because you can't have an association like the NIGP with their important role with the public sector in a position where there is a conflict that may actually harm the public sector rather than help it. Do you see what I'm saying, Bill?
You're preaching to the choir here, John, and it reminds me of a conversation I had a few weeks ago. I was up in Chicago, and a group of us, we were out to dinner, and obviously, in case you haven't heard, John, there's an election going on down here in the States. And so we were talking about the election, and then we were talking, I was mentioning having you on and some of the topics we were going to talk about. And anyway, one of the guys there at dinner, he kind of threw out an analogy, and it's not perfect, but he said it would be as though a government agency hired a company to provide voting system solutions and then charge the voters to vote. Kind of, double dipping, is that right? And well, it all gets back to that word you and I love, transparency. It makes me uncomfortable.
Well, the interest, and it should make us all uncomfortable, because the thought that you can create a monopoly through the misuse of the NIGP code, or the potential misuse, is demonstrated by what happened in Missouri. I mean, Missouri went through their process, and Periscope was bidding, Cyclist was bidding, Perfect Commerce was bidding, other organizations are going after that business. And the state of Missouri, in their wisdom and their process said, we're going with perfect commerce. And the issue was that the challenge wasn't tied into the process itself, but the letter that was endorsed by Rick Grimm, the letter that came in conjunction with Periscope saying, well, you should know this, perfect commerce, and I've got the letter and the link to that in the post. It's saying that they're in violation, they don't do this, that is leveraging that kind of power to try to force the state of Missouri to make a decision that it didn't want to make. And, they stood up and withstood the heat. And what I was told is our coverage of the story played a big part in their ability to, stand their ground. And, of course, Perfect Commerce didn't lose their license, but the fact that they could be threatened to lose their license is what's most disconcerting. And I think that inherently is what we have to guard against. In the procurement world, again, there are so many avenues for potential conflict. There are so many avenues because we're dealing with so much money. And to a certain degree, we are the gatekeepers in terms of how money is spent and where it's spent. These things have to be rooted out. And so, again, the Codegate story, which is still being written, is one example but nobody wanted to cover it. And that was the whole thing. Nobody wanted to go that route. And it's like the coverage of all the other stories that I've had, is that nobody seems to want to pick it up or talk about it. Because it could compromise their relationships or their ties financially. You don't want to annoy. Give you an idea. I met Rick Grimm when I spoke at the Virginia conference in the fall of 2014, and he seemed like a nice enough fellow, and we got along. And he said, we talked about the fact that I would go and speak at the NIGP conference in August of 2015. This is, of course, before the story broke of Codegate. And personally, my decision to cover the story, I'm sure, removed my name from that list and a revenue opportunity for me personally. But at the end of the day, you have to make a choice. Are you going for money or are you going for the truth? And that's really where it came into that way. And interesting enough, Bill, and this is the true heroes of all these stories that I've covered, from SideQuest to NIGP to now the Periscope brewing situation in terms of the Arizona letter, as we call it, is that, for many of these stories, I have at least half a dozen sources. Some are actually insiders and whistleblowers. Some are higher up, well recognized in the industry. And they're coming forward because they feel, much like yourself, much like I do, they have a passion for this industry, and they didn't have an outlet or a vehicle through which they could say, look at what's happening. And if they did, the publications, the media, the blogs that are here now who are more focused on Magic Quadrants or top 50 to watch or know, they're not printing the stories anymore, or they never have. And that goes back to the roots that I referred to at the beginning, is that most of the blogs, most of the coverage is either originally rooted in the service provider side of the equation, or that the income is so closely tied to the service provider that what ends up happening is that they're not going to bite off or bite the hand that feeds them, so to speak. But what's problematic with that, Bill, is the fact that features, functions, and benefits analysis, Magic Quadrants, top 50 companies to watch, that in the scheme of things has very little impact on the success or failure of an e-procurement initiative. The fact remains is that the technology, especially as it becomes more commoditized, is less important. It's a supporting role, but it is less important than who are the people behind these organizations. What are the relationships? What are their service capabilities? And what has been their success factors? No one's talked about that. The Arizona story, for example, with their decision after a long relationship with Periscope to make a change. Well, that might have an impact on other states who may be looking at a Periscope or any particular vendor. That information has to be out there. It's free. It's a free market. It's an open world. The truth, it's the truth, and the facts, they have to get out there so that people can make informed decisions. And that's really where this industry has to grow. Otherwise, if the media continues where there's only one or two voices, and I welcome the day when everybody's competing for writing the same stories and giving the same enthusiasm for getting to the truth that we do through Procurement Insights, we're going to end up like the media and what happened with Theranos. You don't want to rock the boat. You don't want to cut off your revenue stream or cut off access to these senior executives, so you just don't write about it. Well, we've got to change that. Otherwise, we're not really doing a job for the public, for the end user community, for the public and procurement in general. Now, I don't know if you agree with that, but...
No, I do. In my opinion, the more eyes and ears that are out there, the better it is for everybody involved. And I too, and I think you agree, I look forward to the day where there are fewer bullies in the playground. There will never be eliminated. I think it would be naive to suggest that nothing's perfect. Again, that was Mr. Jon Hansen here on the Big Bid Theory. And by the way, Jon, he's a tremendous follow on Twitter at PIBlogger1. Keep a close eye on his blog, Procurement Insights, and you can also listen to Jon's podcast, PI Window on the World Show, on Blog Talk Radio. Often to the delight, groans, and grimaces of our production staff and you, our audience, I know at times, governments post crazy bids. And full disclosure, as I mentioned at the top of the show, this bid isn't crazy in the sense of being odd or weird. It's crazy as in, at least in my humble opinion, different and interesting. I don't have to tell you about the horror stories out there when it comes to pets and, for that matter, even children being left in hot vehicles, particularly, obviously, at this time of year. Far too many stories are out there, tragedies. As a matter of fact, I'm thinking back, there was such an incident here in Austin a couple of years ago. A father left his small child in the vehicle, went into work about his day, distracted, and only to later discover, not good at all. So here's the crazy bid. The Dallas Police Department has a request out there for purchase of a canine heat alert system with pager. And what it is, and I did a little checking around, the system alerts if the law enforcement vehicle's cabins reach high heat temperatures. When that happens, personnel are alerted to act, and again, a potential tragedy is avoided. So you talk about, in so many times in government purchasing, we see this, but talk about interesting and useful technology. Well, certainly, in my opinion, there's an example. And, again, not a crazy bid in the sense of jaw-dropping. And I'll say this, and, we in the production meeting, we all talked about it. You can count us as on board, that people are taking proactive action, including the Dallas Police Department, and we're all for that. That's going to do it. Many thank yous, again, of course, to Jon Hansen for stopping by the show and giving us just a little bit of insight into transparency, covering the government, and those on the periphery. We continue to be indebted to you for downloading, sharing, and following TBBT. Next time, as I look at our upcoming schedule, we're going to actually have a special co-host sitting alongside to kind of help steer this Big Bid Theory ship. We'll have more on that later. And speaking of special, don't forget on the next episode, we'll go ahead and have part 2 of our visit with Jon Hansen. And Jon's going to drill down to some more specifics on stories that he has unearthed, reported on during his travels. It will also be our initial mailbag segment. So continue sending in your questions and comments. And like we've said before, if you'd like to be nice about it, that's perfectly okay with us, or not. My email address is bculhane@bidprime.com. As you're likely aware by now, @TheBigBidTheory is our Twitter handle. And as always, we're grateful when you take a moment to follow us, like, retweet, and do all of those fun things. In addition, my Twitter handle is contract_hunter. And do not forget, we now have our very own Facebook page for the show. And so, please take a second to give us a Facebook like. Thanks in advance for that. On behalf of the Groovin' and Movin' TBBT staff, many salutes and thank yous to the incomparable Jim Ward, who worked tirelessly to help launch our little show. Until next time, go Gunners, Barracudas, Tigers, and Bobcats, and we wish you all the best in growing your business.